It's a target group that has a good idea about, photographs. So we communicate with photographs, and therefore we work together with different photographers. Like for this project of Álvaro César in Rennes with Duccio Malagamba. And when it comes then to the ongoing pages, you see that the most patience and work is on the last pages here on the detailed sections. That's, we are working, I think, every detail is about a month work, more or less. Yeah, so that's what I wanted to say, and I'm curious to hear the others.
Thank you.
That's a Spanish example.
Either way, I'm happy to go. Hello, I'm Manon Mollard. I'm deputy editor at the Architectural Review in London. So the AR, as was mentioned yesterday, was founded in 1896 in London. It's not the oldest architecture magazine I checked last night. Blueprint is actually almost 50 years older. Even Architectural Record is 5 years older. And as I mentioned, the AJ, our sister title, is older by 1 year. So this is the very first cover of the AR in November 1896. In the words of its first editor, Henry Wilson, the AR was the only magazine in the British Empire dealing with the artistic as distinguished from the business side of architecture. And to a certain extent, this remains true today because we don't really consider, we don't consider ourselves a business tool, and we don't do news. So for 122 years now, the AR has been providing critical perspective and stimulating opinions on international architecture. It's always been very global in its reach. And with mainly building studies and in-depth essay, its voice wants to be cultural and campaigning, so it's looking back as well as looking forward. The AR is committed to long-form journalism and to connecting architecture with wider society and the world of ideas. So a lot of the content that we publish, and this has been the case throughout its history, is evergreen, which means that in the way it's commissioned and edited, it will be relevant and will be read as reference for years to come. It doesn't expire, in a way. I chose two projects to kind of talk about the type of content that we do and to explore a little bit this idea of what makes a success and a failure, which made me realize none of the pieces we work on is actually as straightforward as they usually seem, and they're all a mix of successes and failures, and sometimes it's not what you expect. And I chose, so the first project that I picked is a feature we did in 2015 now, but it was a project that was actually completed in 2012. It's by Héctor Viglieca in the south of São Paulo. So it had been published in the press at the time when the project was first completed, and it was what was mentioned yesterday. It's kind of, you had the workers in the corner kind of finishing up, putting the final touches. The walls were pristine, you could almost smell the paint. And so this type of feature we call the revisit, and the idea is to look kind of beyond the catwalk moment of the building completion. And so our revisits are about reevaluating notable work and measuring whether the project succeeded and what lessons can be drawn from it today. They've mostly been about sort of more groundbreaking projects from a previous era. So we did, for example, Álvaro César Quinta da Malagueira in Évora, or in actually the AR's May issue of this year, the latest one, we have Moshe Safdie's Habitat 67 in Montreal with the 51st anniversary. In this instance, it was quite different because we featured the project only 3 years after it was completed, and it was, in a way, a lot less well known. We realized that maybe we didn't have to wait decades to do our revisits. So 3 years after the completion of this project, there we go. There were 2 million people living in this low density, kind of endless sea of self-built 2-story houses, no urban infrastructure. When the situation became too critical and the stream had turned into an open sewer, there were severe risks of landslides and flooding threatening the shacks at the bottom of the valley. So the government of São Paulo, in partnership with the municipality, expropriated the homes of 200 families and relocated them to subsidized rented accommodation nearby. And Vigliecca was invited to develop replacement housing for the site by the construction company that won the public bid. And so the idea for this project, especially because the vision and the premise was kind of, the architect himself said he considered the building as a kind of a piece of infrastructure. We wanted to almost confront the vision of the architect to the reality and assess the success of the project on the ground. So what we did is that we got a critic, a photographer, who turned out to be Leonardo Da Vinotti, who had actually shot the project 3 years prior in 2012 already, and a filmmaker as well, because it was one of the experiments, and I think we should do that more. We need more budget for it, but it was the idea to really bring the project to life and really get a sense of the world around it and the life of it. We think words do one thing, drawings do one thing, photographs do one thing, but films can enable us to do something else. So because it was the Leonardo Da Vinotti, the same photographer, so, I mean, the kind of straightforward deterioration was pretty alarming, but in a way that wasn't the most surprising. Because what we couldn't quite envision was that, so the tenants actually want to put a fence around the building and enclose the inner streets and walkways, and make this kind of pedestrian metal bridge that links the two sides of the valley and that is meant to be for the wider neighborhood, to kind of close it off basically and effectively turn this project into a bit of a gated community. So what was quite, well, the most interesting, I think, is that Vigliecca himself, not only did he actually, accept to play the game, and he was happy to welcome the journalist and the photographer and the filmmaker in his office and review the kind of new shots. It's a 10-minute film, it's quite short, but it starts with him pointing at photographs and saying, oh, this wasn't supposed to be like this, or this wasn't supposed to be like this. And so throughout the video, he actually seeks to understand and explain what went wrong, and the difficulty to understand the needs of these residents. He highlights, for example, and his willingness to transform the whole neighborhood, the inability to do that with a single project, and how he basically created a new condition in this environment, and therefore not the failure, but the problems that he didn't necessarily envision. And so he compares, gated communities in that neighborhood and elsewhere in São Paulo to kind of cancer and the spread of it. And, he says the anti-city, and he speaks of the exclusion of the excluded. So this case study is to say that kind of discussions about post-occupancy are crucially lacking in architectural media. And we're very focused on the kind of the instantaneous and the kind of live stories, and so we feel it's particularly important to pause and look back. And the architect himself, and it's happened with several projects, they're often very grateful is perhaps the wrong word, but they admit that they don't take the time to revisit the project. They hand it over and then their job is done. And perhaps, particularly for print publications with a slow pace, I think this should be one of our core missions. So this is a success in the way that it was covered. It's a part failure as a project, but they don't necessarily go hand in hand, which touches on what Eddie was saying about whether you feature the kind of the more star architect, actually it ends up being the less successful story. And I'll run very quickly, because I don't know how we're doing with time, through the second one, which is a reputations piece about Kim Soo-gun. So he was the most important Korean architect in the 20th century. But I think he's virtually unheard of in the West. Sorry. So I had never actually heard of him before traveling to Seoul last summer, and I was quite amazed to discover his work and his legacy, and he's unanimously considered the godfather of Korean architecture. So he was, following Park's coup d'etat, he was the virtual state architect. He had a first phase in his career where he was doing sculptural béton brut, and what was fascinating is that the kind of his career coincided with kind of the emergence of the modern movement in Korea. So he, for example, designed the first modern building in Korea. So this is war-torn Seoul, and it's a mega structure. It's completely astonishing. It's still standing. They managed to save it, and they're redeveloping it. He set up space magazine. He had a kind of second phase in his career where he left public state projects behind, and he's traded sort of concrete for brick to a certain extent, and he tried to look for a more Korean aesthetic. So he went from kind of state architect to artist. He entered the Pompidou competition with this repetitive kind of hectic pattern of parallel walls centered around an object-lacked courtyard. That was a section. And so we were planning an issue on Korea, and we have a reputations piece each month, which is a profile piece that discusses the life, the work, and the legacy of influential architects. And the idea is to unveil the sometimes slightly hidden character of important figures and depict them as almost human beings rather than just architects. So the tone is kind of conversational and witty, but it seeks to be quite authoritative. And considering that his influence was unrivaled, that everyone speaks about him, we thought it would be a fairly straightforward piece. And it ended up being hugely problematic because, first of all, no one wants to write about him because everyone is scared to say anything about him. And so even just getting a writer proved to be nearly impossible, which was a huge problem for us because we need a reputations piece. We couldn't do a Korea issue without him, and there was effectively no backup. Getting photographs was a nightmare because one of his nieces is managing the foundation. She doesn't want to release any images, although they don't own all the copyright. There's a Japanese photographer who passed away a few years ago who photographed most of his work, and his daughter is friends with his niece. It was an absolute nightmare, and no one wanted to release anything without actually telling us who effectively owned the copyright, which made it, we had to decide whether or not we could go ahead and print stuff, and we kind of didn't really understand. The frustration also came from pretty much no one has heard of him, or he's, very unknown. And we actually want to promote his work, and it's brilliant. And we're not trying to attack him in any significant way. And it turned out to be nearly impossible. I mean, we went ahead. We found a young Korean PhD candidate in Harvard who wrote a very good piece. The niece of Kim Soo-gun ended up ordering 3 copies of the issue. We know because we sell them online, and I know she got them delivered. Haven't heard from her. This was February, so I don't know what she made of it. No feedback. But it's this strange sense of we feel like it could have been a much better piece if people had collaborated a little bit more. At the same time, we're very happy we did it. We ended up, I had iPhone snaps from when I was in Seoul, and we printed them because we had no kind of proper photography. And so it's a bit of a paradox because it should have been much better than it was to a certain extent, and it made us question a little bit what we can do and can't do and what we should do, perhaps. And this I had just found the other day. It's an ad, a subscription ad in the AR and old AR, which is just a small reminder that we can only exist because of our subscribers, and part of the ability to pay for filmmakers or photographers to commission extra photography comes from that, and these days are a bit difficult. Thank you.
May I have the first slide? So hello everyone, my name is Frano Zovko. I'm one of the editors of Oris Architectural Magazine. Oris is an architectural magazine from Zagreb, Croatia that has been published now for almost 20 years. It covers mostly recent architectural production, both regional and local, as well as topics from the fields of design, visual arts, cinema, theory, and so on. I would like to mention that every issue is bilingual, published both in Croatian and in English. So Oris was established in 1998 in a quite specific social and cultural context. Because after the collapse of the Yugoslav socialist project in the 80s, the number and the quality of the projects built according to previously achieved standards dropped significantly. And public discourse or professional discourse on architecture and the built environment almost vanished. So the intention of the first editorial board was to promote exceptionally good works and authors, to cultivate architectural discourse and dialogue between local and international scenes, and also to re-establish broken cultural connections between the countries of the region. And the result was a slightly unusual format of the magazine. So let me explain it here. Within its 200 pages, every issue was opened with a thorough interview with a major figure from the field of architecture, either international or local, and closed with an article or two on theory, visual arts, design, as I said earlier. But the central part was a series of articles on built objects. And every article consisting of some photos, some drawings, and unusually long text. A lengthy textual analysis with, it was always thorough critical evaluation, each written by a different author. Therefore, Luis Fernandez Galeano, the editor of Arquitectura Viva, once perhaps ironically said that Oris is not an architectural magazine but a literary magazine. So,
that's compliment.
here are some of the first covers. Here are the interviews. You can see the different designs. So I explained this initial format of the magazine because it went through surprisingly few changes during the time. The design has been changed for a few times. The number of the pages and length of the articles has been somewhat worrying, but that is much it. We tried to include some new sections such as unbuilt projects, work. You can see some projects here, some versions of the design of the magazine. We are including new categories such as student projects, unbuilt projects, and we are trying to put a stronger emphasis on socialist modernist heritage. But this is pretty much it. It is important to say that our tendency has been to expand the articles, and the articles that started as the articles on objects into articles as the case studies. So, for example, the Kleiberg building we were talking about yesterday, we tried to connect that case with Croatian modernist buildings, which we have a huge number of such buildings in Croatia. We try to establish some connections and try to find some examples for our case. And so I would just like to say a word or two of financing. The revenues of the magazine depend mostly on ads for the construction companies and building materials industry, with less than 10% contribution of